So do we think Penelope accepted Colin's proposal? I actually think, even the year that this story is being written, the period, I still find it a bit odd that he would propose, make such a impromptu, completely unexpected. That's really not something I expected. But what do we think Penelope says? I don't know. Hmm. I don't know. I don't know. I think, and recalling the character that I've come to know, I don't think she says yes, even though she's been crazy about Colin since a very long time. But, anyways, enough of me and my chats. Let's see what Penelope says. All right. She hit the pavement. Penelope was, in her opinion at least, a bit more graceful than most people gave her credit for. She was a good dancer, could play the piano with her fingers arched perfectly, and could usually navigate a crowded room without bumping into an uncommon amount of people or furniture. But when Colin made his rather matter-of-fact proposal, exactly, her foot, at the time halfway out of the carriage, found only air, her left hip found the curb, and her head found Colin's toes. "Good God, Penelope!" he explained, crouching down. "Are you all right?" "Just fine," she managed to get out, searching for the hole in the ground that must have just opened up, so that she could crawl into it and die. "Are you certain?" "It's nothing really," she replied, holding her cheek, which she was certain now sported a perfect imprint of the top of Colin's boot. "Just a bit surprised, that's all." "Why?" "Why?" she echoed. "Yes, why?" She blinked, once, twice, then again. Well, it might have to do with your mentioning marriage." He yanked her unceremoniously to her feet, nearly dislocating her shoulder in the process. "Well, what did you think I would say?" She stared at him in disbelief. Was he mad? "Not that," she finally replied. "I'm not a complete bore," he muttered. She brushed dust and pebbles off her sleeves. "I never said you were. I can assure you," he continued, now looking mortally offended, "that I do not behave as I did with a woman of your background without rendering a marriage proposal." Penelope's mouth fell open, leaving her feeling rather like an owl. "Don't you have a reply?" he demanded. "I'm still trying to figure out what you said," she admitted. He planted his hands on his hips and stared at her with a decided lack of indulgence. "You must admit," she said, her chin dipping until she was regarding him rather dubiously through her lashes. "It did sound rather like you've, how do I say it, rendered marriage proposals before." He scowled at her. "Of course I haven't. Now take my arm before it starts to rain." She looked up at the clear blue sky. "At the rate you're going," he said impatiently, "we'll be here for days." Well, she cleared her throat. "Surely you can forgive my lack of composure in the face of such tremendous surprise." "Now who's speaking in circles?" he muttered. "I beg your pardon?" His hands tightened on her arm. "Let's just get going." "Colin!" she nearly shrieked, tripping over her feet as she stumbled up the stairs. "Are you sure?" "No time like the present," he said, almost jauntily. He seemed quite pleased with himself, which puzzled her, because she would have bet her entire fortune, and as Lady Whistledown, she'd amassed quite a fortune, that he had not intended to ask her to marry him until the moment his carriage had ground to a halt in front her house. Perhaps not even until the words had left his lips. He turned to her. Do I need to knock? No, He knocked anyway, or rather banged, if one wanted to be particular about it. Brierly, Penelope said through an attempted smile, as the butler opened the door to receive them. Miss Penelope, he murmured, one brow rising in surprise. He nodded at Colin. Mr. Bridgerton? Is Mrs. Featherington home? Colin asked brusquely. Yes, but excellent. Colin barged in, pulling Penelope along with him. Where is she? In the drawing room, but I should tell you. But Colin was already halfway down the hall, Penelope one step behind him. Not that she could be anywhere else, seeing as how his hand was wrapped rather tightly around her upper arm. Mr. Bridgerton! The butler yelled out, sounding slightly panicked. Penelope twisted, even as her feet continued to follow Colin. Brierly never panicked about anything. If he didn't think she and Colin ought to enter the drawing room, he had to have a very good reason. Maybe even... Oh no. Penelope dug in her heels, skidding along the hardwood floor as Colin dragged her along by the arm. Colin, she said, gulping on the first syllable. Colin! What? He asked, not breaking a stride. I really think... Ach! Her skidding heels hit the edge of the runner carpet, sending her flying forward. He caught her neatly and set her on her feet. What is it? She glanced nervously at the door to the drawing room. It was slightly ajar, but maybe there was enough noise inside so that her mother hadn't yet heard them approaching. Penelope, Colin prompted impatiently. There was still time to escape, wasn't there? She looked frantically about. Not that she was likely to find a solution to her problems anywhere in the hall. Penelope, Colin said, now tapping his foot. What the devil is the matter? She looked back to Brierly, who simply shrugged his shoulders. This might really not be the best time to speak to my mother. He raised one brow, looking rather like the butler had just seconds earlier. You're not planning to refuse me, are you? No, of course not, she said hastily, even though she hadn't accepted the fact that he even intended to offer for her. Then this is an excellent time, he stated, his tone inviting no further protest. But it's... What? Tuesday, she thought miserably. It was just past noon, which meant... Let's go, Colin said, striding forward, and before she could stop him, he pushed the door open. Oh, brother. Colin's first thought upon stepping into the drawing room was that the day, while certainly not proceeding in any manner he might have anticipated when he'd risen from bed that morning, was turning out to be a most excellent endeavor. Marriage to Penelope was an eminently sensible idea, and surprisingly appealing as well, if their recent encounter in the carriage was any indication. His second thought was that he'd just entered his worst nightmare, because Penelope's mother was not alone in the drawing room. Every last Featherington, current and former, was there, along with assorted spouses and even a cat. It was the most frightening assemblage of people Colin had ever witnessed. Penelope's family was, well, except for Felicity, whom he'd always held in some suspicion. How could one truly trust anyone who was such good friends with Hyacinth? Her family was, well, he couldn't think of a good word for it, certainly nothing complimentary, although he'd like to think he could have avoided an outright insult. And really, was there a word that effectively combined slightly dim, overly talkative, rather meddlesome, excruciatingly dull, and one couldn't forget this, not with Robert Huxley, a recent addition to the clan, uncommonly loud. So Colin just smiled, his great, big, friendly, slightly mischievous smile. It almost always worked, and today was no exception. The Featheringtons all smiled back at him, and, thank goodness, said nothing, at least not right away. Colin, Mrs. Featherington said with a visible surprise. How nice of you to bring Penelope home for our family meeting. Your family meeting? He echoed. He looked to Penelope, who was standing next to him, looking rather ill. Every Tuesday, she said, smiling weakly. Didn't I mention it? No, he replied, even though it was obvious her question had been for the benefit of their audience. No, you didn't mention it. Bridgerton! Bellowed Robert Huxley, who was married to Penelope's eldest sister Prudence. Huxley, Colin returned, taking a discreet step back. Best to protect his eardrums in case Penelope's brother-in-law decided to leave his post near the window. Thankfully, Huxley stayed put, but Penelope's other brother-in-law, the well-meaning but vacant-minded Nigel Burbrook, did cross the room, greeting Colin with a hearty slap on the back. Wasn't expecting you, Burbrook said jovially. No, Colin murmured. I wouldn't think so. Just family, after all, Burbrook said. And you're not family, not my family at least. Not yet, anyway, Colin murmured, stealing a glance at Penelope. She was blushing. Then he looked back at Mrs. Featherington, who looked as if she might faint from excitement. Colin groaned through his smile. He hadn't meant for her to hear his comment about possibly joining the family. For some reason, he'd wanted to retain an element of surprise before he asked for Penelope's hand. If Portia Featherington knew his intentions ahead of time, she'd likely twist the whole thing around, in her mind at least, so that she had somehow orchestrated the match herself. And for some reason, Colin found that exceedingly distasteful. I hope I'm not intruding, he said to Mrs. Featherington. No, of course not, she said quickly. We are delighted to have you here at a family gathering. But she looked rather odd, not precisely undecided about his presence there, but certainly unsure of what her next move should be. She was chewing on her lower lip, and then she darted a furtive glance at Felicity, at all people. Colin turned to Felicity. She was looking at Penelope, a small secret smile mixed to her face. Penelope was glaring at her mother, her mouth twisted into an irritated grimace. Colin's gaze went from Featherington to Featherington to Featherington. Something was clearly simmering under the surface here, and if he weren't trying to figure out A, how to avoid being trapped into conversation with Penelope's relations, while B, somehow managing to issue a proposal of marriage at the same time, well, he'd be rather curious as to what was causing all the secret. underhanded glances being tossed back and forth between the Featherington women. Mrs. Featherington cast one last glance at Felicity, did a little gesture that Colin could have sworn meant, "Sit up straight," then fixed her attention to Colin. "Won't you sit down?" she asked, smiling widely and patting the seat next to her on the sofa. "Of course," he murmured, because there was really no getting out of it now. He still had to ask for Penelope's hand in marriage, and even if he didn't particularly want to do it in front of every last Featherington and their two inane spouses, he was stuck here, at least until a polite opportunity to make his escape presented itself. He turned and offered his arm to the woman he intended to make his bride. "Penelope?" Yes, of course," she stammered, placing her hand at the crook of his elbow. "Oh, yes," Mrs. Featherington said, as if she'd completely forgotten about her daughter's presence. "Terribly sorry, Penelope. Didn't see you. Won't you please go and ask cook to increase our order? We'll surely need more food with Mr. Bridgerton here." "Of course," Penelope said, the corners of her lips quivering. "Can't she ring for it?" Colin asked loudly. "What?" Mrs. Feathering said distractedly. "Well, I suppose she could, but it would take longer. And Penelope doesn't mind, do you?" Penelope gave her head a little shake. "I mind," Colin said. Mrs. Featherington let out a little "oh" of surprise then said, "Very well, Penelope. Why don't you sit right here?" She motioned to a chair that was not quite situated to be a part of the inner conversation circle. Felicity, who was seated directly across from her mother, jumped up. "Penelope, please take my seat." "No," Mrs. Featherington said firmly. "You have been feeling under the weather, Felicity. You need to sit." Colin thought Felicity looked the picture of perfect health, but she sat back down. "Penelope," Prudence said loudly, from over by the window, "I need to speak with you." Penelope glanced helplessly from Colin to Prudence, to Felicity to her mother. Colin yanked her in closer. "I need to speak with her as well," he said smoothly. "Right. Well, I suppose that there is room for both of you," Mrs. Featherington said, scooting over on the sofa. Colin was caught between the good manners that had been drummed into his head since birth and the overwhelming urge to strangle the woman who would someday be his mother-in-law. He had no idea why she was treating Penelope like some sort of lesser-favored stepchild, but really it had to stop. "What brings you this way?" yelled Robert Huxley. Colin touched his ears. He couldn't help himself, then said, "I was—" "Oh, goodness!" fluttered Mrs. Featherington. "We do not mean to interrogate our guest, do we?" Colin hadn't really thought Huxley's question constituted an interrogation, but he didn't really want to insult Mrs. Featherington by saying so, so he merely nodded and said something completely meaningless like, "Yes, well, of course." "Of course what?" asked Philippa. Philippa was married to Nigel Burbrook, and Colin had always thought it was a rather good match indeed. "I'm sorry?" he queried. "You said of course," Philippa said. "Of course what?" "I don't know," Colin said. "Oh, well, then, why did you—" "Philippa," Mrs. Featherington said loudly, "perhaps you should fetch the food, since Penelope has forgotten to ring for me." To ring for it. "Oh, I'm sorry," Penelope said, quickly, starting to rise to her feet. "Don't worry," Colin said through a smooth smile, grabbing hold of her hand and yanking her back down. Your mother said Prudence could go. Philippa, Penelope said. What about Philippa? She said Philippa could go, not Prudence. Oh, brother. He wondered what had happened to her brain, because somewhere between his carriage and this sofa it had clearly disappeared. Does it matter? He asked. No, not really, but Felicity, Mrs. Featherington interrupted. Why don't you tell Mr. Bridgerton about your watercolors? For the life of him, Colin couldn't imagine a less interesting topic, except maybe for Philippa's watercolors. But he nonetheless turned to the youngest Featherington with a friendly smile and asked, And how are your watercolors? But Felicity, bless her heart, gave him a rather friendly smile herself and said nothing but, I imagine they're fine, thank you. Mrs. Featherington looked as if she'd just swallowed a live eel, then exclaimed, Felicity! Yes, Felicity said sweetly. You didn't tell him that you'd won an award. She turned to Colin. Felicity's watercolors are very unique. She turned back to Felicity. Do tell Mr. Bridgerton about your award. Oh, I don't imagine he's interested in that. Of course he is, Mrs. Featherington ground out. Normally, Colin would have chimed in with, Of course I am, since he was, after all, an exceedingly affable fellow, but doing so would have validated Mrs. Featherington's statement, and perhaps more critically, ruined Felicity's good fun. And Felicity appeared to be having a lot of fun. Philippa, she said, weren't you going to go after the food? Oh, right, Philippa replied. Forgot all about it. I do that a lot. Come along, Nigel. You can keep me company. Right on, Nigel beamed, and then he and Philippa left the room, giggling all the way. Colin reaffirmed his conviction that the Burbrook-Featherington match had been a good one indeed. I think I shall go out to the garden, Prudence suddenly announced, taking hold of her husband's arm. Penelope, why don't you come with me? Penelope opened her mouth a few seconds before she figured out what to say, leaving her looking a little bit like a confused fish, but in Colin's opinion a rather fetching fish, if such a thing were possible. Finally, her chin took on a resolute mien, and she said, I don't think so, Prudence. Penelope, Mrs. Featherington exclaimed, I need you to show me something. Prudence ground out. I really think I am needed here, Penelope replied. I can join you later this afternoon if you like. I need you now. Penelope looked to her sister in surprise, clearly not expecting quite so much resistance. I'm sorry, Prudence, she reiterated. I believe I am needed here. Nonsense, Mrs. Featherington said breezily. Felicity and I can keep Mr. Bridgerton company. Felicity jumped to her feet. Oh, no, she exclaimed, her eyes round and innocent. I forgot something. What? Mrs. Featherington asked, between her teeth. Could you possibly have forgotten? My watercolors. She turned to Colin with a sweet, mischievous smile. You did want to see them, didn't you? Of course, he murmured, deciding he very much liked Penelope's younger sister, seeing as how they are so unique. One might say they are uniquely ordinary, Felicity said with an overly earnest nod. Penelope, Mrs. Featherington said, obviously trying to hide her annoyance. Would you be so kind as to fetch Felicity's watercolors? Penelope doesn't know where they are, Felicity said quickly. Why don't you tell her? For God's sake, Colin finally exploded. Let Felicity go. I need a private moment with you anyway. Silence reigned. It was the first time Colin Bridgerton had ever lost his temper in public. Beside him, Colin heard Penelope let out a little gasp, but when he glanced at her, she was hiding a tiny smile behind her hand, and that made him feel ridiculously good. A private moment? Mrs. Featherington echoed, her hand fluttering to her chest. She glanced over at Prudence and Robert, who were still standing by the window. They immediately left the room, although not without a fair bit of grumbling on Prudence's part. Penelope, Mrs. Featherington said, perhaps you should accompany Felicity. Penelope will remain, Colin ground out. Penelope? Mrs. Featherington asked, doubtfully. Yes, he said slowly, in case she still didn't understand his meaning. Penelope, but Colin gave her such a glare that she actually drew back and folded her hands in her lap. I'm gone, Felicity chirped, sailing out of the room. But before she closed the door behind her, Colin saw her give a quick wink to Penelope, and Penelope smiled, love for her younger sister shining clearly in her eyes. Colin relaxed. He hadn't realized just how tense Penelope's misery was making him, and she was definitely miserable, good God. He couldn't wait to remove her from the bosom of her ridiculous family. Mrs. Featherington's lips spread into a feeble attempt at a smile. She looked from Colin to Penelope and back again, and then finally said, You desired a word? Yes, he replied, eager to get this done with. I would be honored if you would grant me your daughter's hand in marriage. For a moment, Mrs. Featherington made no reaction. Then her eyes grew round, her mouth grew round, her body, well, her body was already round, and she clapped her hands together, unable to say anything other than, Oh, oh! And then, Felicity, Felicity, Felicity? Portia Featherington jumped to her feet, ran to the door, and actually screamed like a fishwife. Felicity, Felicity! Oh, mother, Penelope moaned, closing her eyes. Why are you summoning Felicity? Colin asked, rising to his feet. Mrs. Featherington turned to him quizzically. Don't you want to marry Felicity? Oh, brother. Colin actually thought he might be sick. No, for God's sake, I don't want to marry Felicity, he snapped. If I'd wanted to marry Felicity, I'd hardly have sent her upstairs for her bloody watercolors, would I? Mrs. Featherington swallowed uncomfortably. Mr. Bridgerton, she said, wringing her hands together, I don't understand. Oh, brother. He stared at her in horror, which then turned to disgust. Penelope, he said, grabbing her hand and yanking her until she was pressed close to his side. I want to marry Penelope. Penelope? Mrs. Featherington echoed. But what? He interrupted, his voice pure menace. But... It's all right, Colin, Penelope said hastily. No, it's not all right, he exploded. I've never given any indication I am the least bit interested in Felicity. Felicity appeared in the doorway, clapped her hand over her mouth, and quickly disappeared, wisely shutting the door behind her. Yes, Penelope said, placatingly, shooting a quick look at her mother. But Felicity is unmarried, and so are you, he pointed out. I know, but I am old, and Felicity is an infant, he spat. Good God. Marrying her would be like marrying Hyacinth. Uh, except for the incense. Except for the incest, Penelope said. He gave her an extremely unamused look. Right, she said, mostly to fill the silence. It's just it's just a terrible misunderstanding, isn't it? No one said anything. Penelope looked at Colin pleadingly. Isn't it? It certainly is, he muttered. She turned to her mother. Mama? Penelope? She murmured, and Penelope knew that her mother wasn't asking her a question. Rather, she was still expressing her disbelief that Colin would want to marry her. Oh boy. How sad is that, right? How sad is that for Penelope? That her mother wouldn't think that, a guy like Colin would want to marry her. That's pretty sad, right? I think I'd feel pretty sad about that. And oh, but it hurts so much. You'd think she'd be used to it by now. I would like to marry Mr. Bridgerton, Penelope said, trying to summon up so much dignity as she could manage. He asked me and I said yes. Well, I guess I was wrong about that. Well, of course you would say yes, her mother retorted. You'd have to be an idiot to say no. Mrs. Featherington, Colin said tightly, I suggest you begin treating my future wife with a bit more respect. Colin, it's not necessary, Penelope said, placing her hand on his arm, but the truth was her heart was a-soaring. He might not love her, but he cared about her. No man could defend a woman with such fierce protectiveness without caring for her a little. It is necessary, he returned. For God's sake, Penelope, I arrived with you. I made it abundantly clear that I required your presence in the room, and I practically shoved Felicity out the door to fetch her watercolors. Why on earth would anyone think I wanted Felicity? Mrs. Featherington opened and closed her mouth several times before finally saying, I love Penelope, of course, but do you know her? Colin shot back. She's lovely and intelligent and has a fine sense of humor. Who wouldn't want to marry a woman like that? Penelope would have melted to the floor if she weren't already holding onto his hand. Thank you, she whispered, not caring if her mother hurt her, not even really caring if Colin hurt her. Somehow she needed to say the words for herself, not what she thought she was. Lady Danbury's face swam before her eyes, her expression warm and just a little bit cunning. Something more. Maybe Penelope was something more, and maybe Colin was the only other person to realize that as well. It made her love him all the more. Her mother cleared her throat, then stepped forward and gave Penelope a hug. It was all, at first, a hesitant embrace on both of their parts, but then Portia tightened her arms around her third-born daughter, and with a choked cry, Penelope found herself returning the hug in equal measure. I do love you, Penelope, Portia said, and I am very pleased for you. She drew back and wiped a tear from her eye. I shall be lonely without you, of course, since I'd assumed we would grow old together, but this is what's best for you, and that, I suppose, is what being a mother is all about. Penelope let out a loud sniffle, then blindly reached for Colin's handkerchief, which he had already pulled from his pocket and was holding in front of her. You'll learn some day, Portia said, patting her on the arm. She turned to Colin and said, "We are delighted to welcome you to the family." He nodded, not terribly warmly, but Penelope thought he made a rather nice effort, considering how angry he had been just moments earlier. Penelope smiled and squeezed his hand, aware that she was about to embark upon the adventure of her life. "You know," Eloise said 3 days after Colin and Penelope made their surprise announcement, "it's really a pity that Lady Whistledown has retired, because this would have been the coup of the decade." "Certainly from Lady Whistledown's viewpoint," Penelope murmured, lifting her teacup to her lips and keeping her eyes trained on the wall clock in Lady Bridgerton's informal drawing-room. Better not to look at Eloise directly. She had a way of noticing secrets in a person's eyes. It was funny. Penelope had gone years without worrying that Eloise would discover the truth about Lady Whistledown. At least, not worrying overmuch. But now that Colin knew, it somehow felt as if her secret were floating about in the air, like particles of dust, just waiting to form into a cloud of knowledge. Maybe the Bridgertons were like dominoes. Once one found out, it was only a matter of time before they all fell. "What do you mean?" Eloise asked, breaking into Penelope's nervous thoughts. "If I recall correctly," Penelope said very carefully, "she once wrote that she would have to retire if I ever married a Bridgerton." Eloise's eyes bugged out. "She did?" "Or something like that," Penelope said. "You're joking," Eloise said, making a piff sort of sound as she waved her hand dismissively. "She would never have been that cruel." Penelope coughed, not really thinking that she could end the topic by faking a biscuit crumb in her throat, but trying nonetheless. "No, really," Eloise persisted. "What did she say?" "I don't recall precisely. Try." Penelope stalled by setting her cup down and reaching for another biscuit. They were alone for tea, which was odd, but Lady Bridgerton had dragged Colin off on some errand regarding the upcoming wedding set for only a month hence, and Hyacinth was off shopping with Felicity, who had, upon hearing Penelope's news, thrown her arms around her sister and shrieked her delight until Penelope's ears had gone numb. As far as sisterly moments went, it had been something wonderful. "Well," Penelope said, chewing on a bite of biscuit, "I believe she said that if I married a Bridgerton, it would be the end of the world as she knew it, and as she wouldn't be able to make heads or tails of such a world, she would have to retire immediately." Eloise stared at her for a moment. "That's not a precise recollection." "One doesn't forget things like that," Penelope demurred. "Hmm." Eloise's nose wrinkled with disdain. "Well, that was rather horrid of her, I must say. Now I doubly wish she were still writing, because she would have to eat an entire gaggle of crow." "Do crows gather in gaggles?" "I don't know," Eloise replied promptly, "but they should." "You're a very good friend, Eloise," Penelope said quietly. "Yes," Eloise said with an affected sigh. "I know, the very best." Penelope smiled. Eloise's breezy reply made it clear that she wasn't in the mood for emotion or nostalgia, which was fine. There was a time and place for everything. Penelope had said what she wanted to say, and she knew that Eloise returned the sentiment, even if she preferred to joke and tease at the moment. I must confess, though, Eloise said, reaching for another biscuit, you and Colin did surprise me. We surprised me as well, Penelope admitted wryly. Not that I'm not delighted, Eloise hastened to add. There's no one I'd rather have as a sister. Well, aside from the ones I already have, of course. And if I'd ever dreamed the two of you were inclined in that direction, I'm sure I would have meddled horribly. I know, Penelope said, laughter forcing her lips up at the corners. Yes, well, Eloise waved the comment away. I am not known for minding my own business. What's that on your fingers? Penelope asked, leaning forward for a better look. What? That? Oh, nothing. But she settled her hands in her lap nonetheless. It's not nothing, Penelope said. Let me see. It looks like ink. Well, of course it does. It is ink. Then why didn't you say so when I asked? Because, Eloise said pertly, it's none of your business. Penelope drew back in shock at Eloise's sharp tongue. I'm terribly sorry, she said stiffly. I had no idea it was such a sensitive subject. Oh, it's not, Eloise said quickly. Don't be silly. It's just that I am clumsy and I can't write without getting ink all over my fingers. I suppose I could wear gloves, but then they'd be stained, and I'd be forever replacing them, and I can assure you that I have no wish to spend my entire allowance, meager as it is, on gloves. Penelope stared at her through her lengthy explanation, then asked, What were you writing? Nothing, Eloise said dismissively. Just letters. Penelope could tell from Eloise's brisk tone that she didn't particularly want to subject the topic to further exploration, but she was being so uncharacteristically evasive that Penelope couldn't resist asking, To whom? The letters? Yes, Penelope replied, even though she thought that was rather obvious. Oh, not me. No one. Well, unless they're a diary, they're not to no one, Penelope said, impatience adding a short tinge to her voice. Eloise gave her a vaguely affronted look. You're rather nosy today. Only because you're being so evasive. They're just to Francesca, Eloise said with a little snort. Well, then why didn't you say so? Eloise crossed her arms. Perhaps I didn't appreciate your questioning me. Penelope's mouth fell open. She couldn't remember the last time she and Eloise had had anything even remotely approaching a row. Eloise, she said, her shock showing her in her voice. What is wrong? Nothing is wrong. I know that's not true. Eloise said nothing, just pursed her lips and glanced toward the window, a clear attempt to end the conversation. Are you angry with me? Penelope persisted. Why would I be angry with you? I don't know, but it's clear that you are. Eloise let out a little sigh. I'm not angry. Well, you're something. I'm just. She shook her head. I don't know what I am. Restless, I suppose, out of sorts. Penelope was silent as she digested that, then said quietly, Is there anything I can do? No. Eloise smiled wryly. If there were, you can be sure I'd have already asked it of you. Penelope felt something that was almost a laugh rising within her. How like Eloise to make such a comment. I suppose it's Eloise began, her chin lifting in thought. No, never mind. No, Penelope said, reaching out and taking her friend's hand. Tell me. Eloise pulled her hand free and looked away. You think I'm silly. Maybe. Penelope said with a smile, but you'll still be my very closest friend. Oh, Penelope, but I'm not, Eloise said sadly. I'm not worthy of it. Eloise, don't talk with such madness. I'd have gone right out insane trying to navigate London and society and the ton without you. Eloise smiled. We did have fun, didn't we? Well, yes, when I was with you, Penelope admitted. The rest of the time I was bloody miserable. Penelope, I don't believe I've ever heard you curse before. Penelope gave her a sheepish smile. It slipped out, and besides, I couldn't possibly think of a better adjective to describe life for a wallflower among the ton. Eloise let out an unexpected chuckle. Now, that's a book I would like to read. A wallflower among the ton. Not unless you're given to tragedies. Oh, come now, it couldn't be a tragedy. It would have to be a romance. You're getting your happy ending after all. Penelope smiled. As strange as it was, she was getting her happy ending. Colin had been a lovely and attentive fiancé, at least for the 3 days that he'd been playing that role, and it couldn't have been particularly easy. They'd been subject to more speculation and scrutiny than Penelope could have imagined. She wasn't surprised, though, when she, as Lady Whistledown, had written that the world would end as she knew it if a Featherington married a Bridgerton. She rather thought she'd been echoing a prevalent sentiment. To say that the ton had been shocked by Penelope's engagement would have been an understatement indeed. But much as Penelope liked to anticipate and reflect upon her upcoming marriage, she was still a bit disturbed about Eloise's strange mood. Eloise, she said seriously, I want you to tell me what has you so upset. Eloise sighed. I'd hoped you'd forgotten about it. I've learned tenacity from the master, Penelope commented. That made Eloise smile, but only for a moment. I feel so disloyal, she said. What have you done? Oh, nothing. She patted her heart. It's all inside. I... She stopped, looked to the side, her eyes settling on the fringed corner of the carpet. But Penelope suspected that she didn't see much of anything, at least nothing beyond what was rumbling about in her mind. I'm so happy for you, Eloise said, the words tumbling forth in odd bursts, punctuated by awkward pauses. And I honestly think I can really truly say that I'm not jealous. But at the same time, Penelope waited for Eloise to collect her thoughts, or maybe she was collecting her courage. At the same time, she said, so softly that Penelope could barely hear her, I suppose I always thought you'd be a spinster right along with me. I've chosen this life. I know that. I have. I could have married. I know, Penelope said quietly, but I never did, because it never seemed right, and I didn't want to settle for anything less than what my brothers and sisters have. And now Colin too, she said, motioning toward Penelope. Penelope didn't mention that Colin had never said he loved her. It didn't seem like the right time, or frankly, the sort of thing she cared to share. Besides, even if he didn't love her, she still thought he cared about her, and that was enough. I would never have wanted you not to marry, Eloise explained. I just never thought you would. She closed her eyes, looking quite agonized. That came out all wrong. I've insulted you terribly. No, you haven't, Penelope said, meaning it. I never thought I would marry either. Eloise nodded sadly, and somehow it's made it all right. I was almost 28 and unmarried, and you were already 28 and unmarried, and we'd always have each other, but now you have Colin. I still have you too. At least I hope I do. Of course you do, Eloise said fervently, but it won't be the same. You must cleave unto your husband, or at least that's what they all say, she added with a slightly mischievous spark in her eyes. Colin will come first, and that is how it should be. And frankly, she added, her smile growing a bit sly, I'd have to kill you if you didn't. He's my favorite brother, after all. It really wouldn't do for him to have a disloyal wife. Penelope laughed out loud at that. Do you hate me? Eloise asked. Penelope shook her head. No, she said softly. If anything, I love you all the more, because I know how difficult it must have been to be honest with me about this. I'm so glad you said that, Eloisa said with a loud, dramatic sigh. I was terrified you'd say that the only solution would be for me to find myself a husband as well. The thought had crossed Penelope's mind, but she shook her head and said, Of course not. Good, because my mother has been saying it constantly. Penelope smiled wryly. I'd be surprised if she hadn't. Good afternoon, ladies. The two women looked up to see Colin entering the room. Penelope's heart did a little flip upon seeing him, and she found herself oddly out of breath. Her heart had been doing little flips for years whenever he walked into a room, but it was somehow different now, more intense. Perhaps because she knew what it was like to be with him, to be wanted by him, to know that he would be her husband. Her heart flipped again. Colin let out a loud groan. You ate all the food? There was only one small plate of biscuits, Eloisa said in their defense. That's not what I was led to believe, Colin grumbled. Penelope and Eloise shared a glance, then both burst out laughing. What? Colin demanded, leaning down to press a quick, dutiful kiss on Penelope's cheek. You sound so sinister, Eloise explained. It's just food. It's never just food, Colin said, plopping down in a chair. Penelope was still wondering when her cheek would stop tingling. So, he said, taking a half-eaten biscuit off of Eloise's plate. What were you two talking about? Lady Whistledown, Eloise said promptly. Penelope choked on her tea. Were you? Colin said softly, but Penelope detected a definite edge in his voice. Yes, Eloise said. I was telling Penelope that it is really too bad she's retired, since your engagement would have been quite the most newsworthy piece of gossip we've had all year. Interesting how that works out, Colin muttered. Eloise agreed. And she surely would have devoted an entire column just to your engagement ball tomorrow night. Penelope did not lower her teacup from her mouth. Do you want some more? Eloise asked her. Penelope nodded and handed her the cup, although she very much missed having it in front of her face as a shield. She knew that Eloise had blurted out Lady Whistledown's name because she did not want Colin to know that she had mixed feelings about his marriage, but still, Penelope fervently wished that Eloise had said anything else in reply to Colin's question. Why don't you ring for more food? Eloise asked Colin. Already did so, he answered. Wickham intercepted me in the hall and asked if I was hungry. He popped the last bite of Eloise's biscuit into his mouth. Wise man, that Wickham. Where did you go today, Colin? Penelope asked, eager to get the topic firmly off of Lady Whistledown. He gave his head a beleaguered shake. Devil if I know. Mother dragged me from shop to shop. Aren't you 33 years old? Eloise inquired sweetly. He answered her with a scowl. Just thought you'd be beyond the age of having Mother drag you about, that's all, she murmured. Mother will be dragging all of us about when we're doddering old fools, and you know it, he replied. Besides, she's so delighted to see me married, I really can't bring myself to spoil her fun. Penelope sighed. This had to be why she loved the man. Anyone who treated his mother so well would surely be an excellent husband. And how are your wedding preparations coming along, Penelope? Colin asked. She hadn't meant to pull a face, but she did anyway. I have never been so exhausted in all my life, she admitted. He reached over and grabbed a large crumb off her plate. We should elope. Oh, could we really? Penelope asked, the words flying from her lips in an unsummoned rush. He blinked. Actually, I was joking mostly, although it does seem a prime idea. I shall arrange for a ladder, Eloise said, clapping her hands together, so that you might climb to her room and steal her away. There's a tree, Penelope said. Colin would have no difficulty with it. Good gosh, he said. You're not serious, are you? No, she sighed. But I could be if you were. I can't be. Do you know what it would do to my mother? He rolled his eyes. Not to mention yours? Penelope groaned. I know. She'd hunt me down and kill me, Colin said. Mine or yours. Both. They'd join forces. He craned his neck toward the door. Where is the food? You just got here, Colin, Eloise said. Give them time. And here I thought, Wickham, a sorcerer, he grumbled, able to conjure food with the snap of his hand. Here you are, sir, came Wickham's voice, as he sailed into the room with a large tray. See, Colin said, raising his brows first at Eloise and then at Penelope. I told you so. Why, Penelope asked, do I sense that I will be hearing those words from your lips far too many times in my future? Most likely because you will, Colin replied. You'll soon learn. He shot her an extremely cheeky grin that I am almost always right. Oh, please, groaned Eloise. I may have to side with Eloise on this one, Penelope said. Against your husband? He placed a hand on his heart, while the other one reached for a sandwich. I am wounded. You're not my husband yet. Colin turned to Eloise. The kitten has claws. Eloise raised her brows. You didn't realize that before you proposed? Of course I did, he said, taking a bite of his sandwich. I just didn't think she'd use them on me. And then he looked at her with such a hot, masterful expression that Penelope's bones went straight to water. Well, Eloise announced, rising quite suddenly to her feet, I think I shall allow you two soon-to-be newlyweds a moment or two of privacy. How positively forward-thinking of you, Colin murmured. Eloise looked to him with a peevish twist to her mouth. Anything for you, dear brother. Or rather, she added, her expression growing arch, anything for Penelope. Colin stood and turned to his betrothed. I seem to be slipping down the pecking order. Penelope just smiled behind her teacup and said, I am making it my policy never to get in the middle of a Bridgerton spat. Ho, ho, Eloise chortled. You will not be able to keep to that one, I'm afraid. Mrs. Soon-to-be Bridgerton. Besides, she added with a wicked grin, if you think this is a spat, I can't wait until you see us in full form. You mean I haven't? Penelope asked. Both Eloise and Colin shook their heads in a way that made her extremely fearful. Oh dear. Is there something I should know? Penelope asked. Colin grinned rather wolfishly. It's too late now. Penelope gave Eloise a helpless glance, but all she did was laugh as she left the room, closing the door firmly behind her. Now, that was nice of Eloise, Colin murmured. What? Penelope asked innocently. His eyes gleamed. The door. The door? Oh, she yelped, the door. Colin smiled, moving over to the sofa beside her. There was something rather delightful about Penelope on a rainy afternoon. He'd hardly seen her since they'd become engaged. Wedding plans had a way of doing that to a couple, and yet she'd not been out of his thoughts even as he slept. Funny how that happened. He'd spent years not really ever thinking about her unless she was standing in front of his face, and now she had permeated his every last thought, his every last desire. How had this happened? When had it happened? And did it really matter? Maybe the only important thing was that he wanted her and she was, or at least she would be, his. Once he put his ring on her finger, the hows, whys, and whens would become irrelevant, provided that this madness he felt never went away. He touched his finger to her chin, tipping her face up to the light. Her eyes shone with anticipation and her lips. Dear gosh, how was it possible that the men of London had never noticed how perfect they were? He smiled. This was a permanent madness, and he couldn't have been more pleased.